This is Outrageous History. Hello, I'm Ernest Granson, and welcome to Outrageous History. In the era prior to the internet, there used to be an important medium called the magazine. And no, it wasn't called the print magazine, just the magazine. And one of the most popular types of magazines was the photographic magazine, the most well-known being Life. The photojournalists who took those photos and supplied the written stories behind them became media stars. Lee Miller emerged as one of the most prominent photojournalists during the Second World War. Some of the photos she snapped in Europe near the end of the war were shocking testimony to Nazi atrocities. But by the time she passed away at the age of 70 in 1977, her name would be familiar with only a relatively few people. Her career as a photojournalist during that time period was only one phase of an extraordinary and unfortunately to some extent a sad life. Author and art critic Carolyn Burke has chronicled the life of Lee Miller in the biography Lee Miller, A Life. Carolyn joins us from her home in Santa Cruz, California. Thanks for being with us, Carolyn.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, Ernest.
Carolyn Lee Miller became renowned for her photography and her descriptions of war-torn Europe, but really there were a lot of phases in her career and her life because those two elements were completely intertwined, weren't they?
Yes, I have to agree with you. It's a remarkably rich life in which all the phases are intertwined, as you say.
And really, her career originated in front of the camera as a model before she moved on to gaining her experience behind the camera.
It's surprising to learn that she began her career on the cover of Vogue magazine and in its pages, where she modeled at a young age, starting at 20, for all the top photographers, including Steichen and Genthe and others. So she learned her trade from them very early on.
Now, she never seemed to have any problem in approaching people who interested her or who were able to possibly advance her career. For instance, when she arrived at the doorstep of Man Ray in Paris, who was already quite renowned, she announced she wanted to become his photography student, even though he insisted he didn't take students. Despite that, he was convinced to take her. She seemed to have a mesmerizing effect.
Well, it's a combination of elements. To begin with, her very, very stunning beauty. She had the perfect, we could say, flapper looks. We're talking about the late 1920s, with her short hair, her blonde, vivacious and unconventional ways. And she was also bold. She probably struck people as a beautiful example of this curious creature known as the New Woman. She was a woman who seemed not to have any doubt about her own abilities and the rightness of her desire to do whatever she wanted to do, including be Man Ray's student, although he didn't take any.
Now, that seemed to be, she seemed to, that would seem to originate from very early on in her life, even as a young girl. And she was constantly in trouble in school. So that seemed to be a progression throughout her later life.
Correct. I would say that from early childhood, she wanted to be one of the boys. She wanted the same freedoms that her two brothers had, and the family didn't see any reason to deprive her of them. In particular, her father allowed her to do all the things that the boys did. And so that was probably implanted early on, the attitude that she should have the same rights and freedoms.
Now, she spent a lot of her time as part of what to me is that puzzling circle of artists and friends known as the Surrealists.
Mhm.
Can you explain your definition of surrealists and surrealism, and also, whether or not you actually believe that Lee Miller considered herself a surrealist?
Well, that's a good question and a complicated one. To start with, a fairly standard understanding of what the surrealists were doing would be to say that it's an art and social and cultural movement in Europe that sprang up after World War I, very much in the aftermath of the war, and also very much growing out of the Dada movement, which was more nihilistic and which preceded surrealism in the late 1910s. Surrealism comes into being more or less in the early 1920s, so 100 years ago, under André Breton and his friends. The idea, Breton's idea, and which many of his fellow surrealists shared, was that the conventions of society were far too constraining and constricting, and that what they would do as artists and writers and social activists was to find ways through their art and their writing and their performance art, we'd call it now, to shake things up, to shake up the constraints of conventional society, so as to let the impulses of the unconscious come through, to liberate all of those forces that were kept down in the human realm by the forces of convention. So that was something about the surrealist plan, what they wanted to do, how they saw themselves. And they were really into shaking up society in personal behavior as well. Well, what did Lee think? She never joined the surrealist movement. And it's interesting to note that you had to formally join and be accepted, to be declared an official surrealist. If Breton didn't want you as part of the gang, you weren't going to be considered one. She never joined up, and yet she took advantage of all the liberatory activities that the surrealists were putting on when she was with Man Ray, who was a member of their group. And yet she stood at something of a distance as a woman. She was early on asked to play the part of the surrealist woman, which is a whole discussion in and of itself. What is a surrealist woman? How does surrealism's shaking up of society benefit the female sex? So we could stop there. Perhaps you have other things to add to this consideration.
Well, from reading your book, what as you mentioned, the surrealists believed it was their responsibility to disrupt current society, and
yes.
And one of those ways was to engage what we called in the 1970s was free love. I mean, your descriptions of their relationships in their various circles seemed to suggest that it was a sexual free-for-all amongst the group. Did Lee Miller buy into that as part of surrealism, or was she, and here's a bit of a deeper question, was she actually reacting to the sexual assault that occurred to her in her early life?
That's a very, very important question when we think about her life. I could back up a little bit and talk about the early assault, because that, as you suggest, may be one of the elements that underlies her adoption of this sexual freedom, free-for-all, as you call it, which occurred at one point in the summer of, I think, 1936, when the surrealists were on vacation and everybody was sleeping with everybody else. But to go back to Lee's early childhood, at the age of 7, she was staying with family friends who went out for the day to do who knows what, and left her in the care of some young male relative of theirs, not of hers. The details of this story are frustratingly vague. However, we know that this man took advantage of her, assaulted the 7-year-old, and this led to her removal from the household. She was taken back to her home in Poughkeepsie, where her mother, who was a nurse, administered what was then available in the way of treatment because she contracted a venereal disease at the time. And so this little 7-year-old has not only been molested, abused, but had to undergo a very, very painful treatment at the young age of 7. Now, what we know about how else the family tried to help at the time was that her father, who was a very progressive thinker in many different ways, according to the standards of the era, took her for psychoanalytic treatment, thinking that that would help because there were some consequences, as we can imagine. And as a result of that treatment and this, the times, his progressive beliefs and the overall difficulty of saying anything about what had happened to her, this was a deep shame. This couldn't be exposed in public. Her father told her that love and sex were two different things, so as to make her feel that while she had been abused, while she was seen as quote unquote damaged goods, that didn't mean that should interfere with her physical and a romantic, erotic being later on. Who knows what effect this kind of combined treatment, the extreme pain of the drugs administered, the shame, the psychoanalytic sessions, the hush-hush, all of this is happening before 1914. What this did to the little girl. We think it probably was kind of buried. That would be a normal way. It kind of went underground, and one possible consequence, as specialists about child sexual abuse have pointed out, is that a child later on will avoid any sexual situation. Another consequence, the opposite extreme, is a great freedom. In those days, we called it promiscuity. So where did Lee fall? Somewhere in the midst of that range, perhaps. She did have a very free sexual life as a young woman and as a grown-up, even before she went to Paris, even before she met Man Ray and the Cibulas. So she was ready for, again, having the same freedoms as a man might. And in these circumstances, the men in the Surrealist movement had tremendous freedom. They could just have anybody they wanted, so to speak. So there she was in a situation that's complicated, but at this remove, we can kind of understand it.
There also I would think there would also be complications created through the relationship between her and her father, Theodore. When I look at his insistence in taking nude photographs throughout her childhood and right into her, her late teens and 20s, I guess. I mean, you have to wonder about that. How did the two of them convince themselves that this was acceptable, and what impact would that have had on her life?
Well, that's another central issue in her life, her development, her relationship to photography, to men. And it's one that I had to ponder and go into very carefully. When I first started working on this material, on this book, I felt very critical of Theodore, her father. Naturally, being a person of my era, I leaned in the direction of thinking that he was culpable, although we have no definitive evidence, Ernest, as you probably know. It looks as if that while that relationship between father and daughter was overly intimate, it probably didn't go beyond the deep emotional intimacy. It probably was not consummated in the technical sense that we might use now. I started off with that idea thinking, good heavens, this father. I was all ready to assign a great measure of culpability to him. The more I looked into it, and the more I was able to interview Elie's friends from that era, from back in Poughkeepsie when she was a girl, the more I found out that Theodore, who was something of a, we would call him a dirty old man, not only loved to photograph girls without their clothes on, but would talk any woman he met into undressing for him in the name of art. Here's how they justified all these nude photographs. You could take a woman's picture without her clothes on, provided one, she's standing still, as in the tableau vivant tradition, where women would pose as classical statues. That was okay, as long as they didn't move. You could also take nude pictures of a variety of women, including your daughter, if you called this art with a capital A, and if you persuaded the object of interest that if she didn't do this, then she was a prude, that this was the progressive, forward-thinking thing to do. So those are some of the justifications. And I think probably Lee went along with the deal. She was so fond of her father. They were very, very close. She loved him all her life. And from what I've been able to learn about people who saw them together when she was much older and he was an old fellow, it was a very affectionate relationship. So all in all, it turned out to be not what I had imagined when I first started working on the book. I was very surprised. I still think it's an overly intimate situation and probably one that did the little girl harm.
So, Carolyn, maybe you can take us through her life journey, just so we know what it looks like in a linear path from her school days through Paris and some of her travels and to where she wound up.
Certainly. She was born in 1907 in Poughkeepsie, New York, which she referred to as Poke, or as Pokey. Poughkeepsie, while a comfortable town for the Millers, who had a very nice house. Their father was an executive in one of the local businesses, an important man, a pillar of the society. Nonetheless, it was too small townish, too conventional, too tight-laced for Lee from the early days. So she, as you said, she never did well at school. She rebelled at every single school she was sent to and even kicked out of some of them. So her father who ran the household, of course, was very forgiving of her quote unquote misbehavior and even subsidized her first trip to Paris when she was only 16. He understood something about his daughter, that she needed more stimulation, more freedom, as we've said, and above all, more artistic inspiration, because she was artistically inclined early on. So she went to Paris. In fact, he took her. And she studied first at a school for theater, a very avant-garde school for staging theater work of all kinds, which she loved. That allowed her to express a lot of her creative impulses. When she came back, she attended some courses at Vassar, which is in Poughkeepsie, and worked in the theater department and with the amateur theater companies, which were at quite a high level there. This is the time of Eugene O'Neill. The theater is a very forward-looking medium for people with artistic abilities and imagination. However, even that got to be kind of too narrow for her. And she moved, I think, was she 19 or 20 when she moved to New York City with one of her brothers to attend the Art Students League. She was going in the direction of being, not that she was ever serious, I was about to say a serious art student. So she also studied at the Art Students League and got a decent preliminary training there. But while she was having a very good time with the art students and the other sort of bohemian types, already she's in with a circle who were much more defiant and more progressive, we could say, in their ways of doing things. She was discovered by chance, that wonderful story of her nearly falling in front of a moving car on a Manhattan street and being plucked out of the way the car by none other than Condé Nast himself, who then looked at her and said, "My dear, have you ever thought of modeling?" This is one of the many wonderful stories. So he gave her his card, and the next thing you know, she was working as a model because she was so stunning and so much of the exact looks and type of the era, the late 20s. She was modeling for Vogue. Well, even that, although she worked with the best photographers and under the most advanced circumstances, she learned all the techniques for the latest cameras, for distances, for lighting, things she already knew about from her studies in the theater and art school. She wanted to go behind the camera, as you said, and she asked Steichen, who would he recommend for her as a teacher? He said, of course, the most advanced photographer is Man Ray, but he's in Paris. Well, she managed to arrange her life because she was always very good at doing what she wanted, as you said, to get to Paris after not very long, leaving behind her glamorous Manhattan life and many boyfriends. And then the next wonderful story that you mentioned is her turning up, knocking on Man Ray's door in Montparnasse, and very quickly persuading him to take her as a student. He took her also as a companion, as a lover, soon as his darkroom assistant, as his model. She became a very, very central element in his life. And that way, she learned the rest of what she wanted, his very advanced and imaginative techniques. Well, we would want to start with her own photographic work in Paris when she established herself as somewhat separate from Man Ray, when she had her own jobs of various sorts, including filming for the movies. And she first signed her photographs that appeared in Vogue under her own name. So she became a professional photographer in Paris in the early 30s. We could say roughly in the surrealist milieu, but keeping her close ties to Vogue as a Vogue professional quite early. And then she went back to New York and established her own studio in 1934. It was said at the time that the place to get your portrait done was at Lee Miller's studio. So she was quite a fashionable photographer and a fixture for a couple of years in the New York magazine world, and we have to say a very glamorous presence working there with her younger brother. But she got tired of it all. She wasn't someone whose interests necessarily lasted forever, and she would get tired of doing one thing and move to another. What happened was with the Egyptian you mentioned, they had met in Europe. This was a very elegant, well-educated, well-to-do Egyptian man named Aziz Eloui Bey, one of the, we could say, aristocracy of the international set in Cairo. He had fallen in love with her. He came to New York in pursuit of her and said, "My dear, if you're tired of all this, why don't you marry me and come to live in Cairo? You can do whatever you want." Which she did after introducing him to her family. So then there's a Cairo period in the late 30s when, in fact, she began to do some of her most stunning and original photography. She was very competent professional and inspired by the new scenes and types of people and situations that she encountered living in Egypt. However, she got impatient with all of that too after a few years, and perhaps with the marriage, and met someone else, another man, Roland Penrose, who was from the surrealist set, an English surrealist who was a good friend of Man Ray. These two fell in love, entered into a quite torrid love affair, traveling around Europe, and got back to England just in time to get to safety before the declaration of war by England on Nazi Germany. In other words, just in September 39. So it's from that point on, when she lived in England, in London with Penrose, that she was determined and eager to find a way to get involved in war work. You'll remember that everybody, all the artists and writers, wanted to find ways to take part in the war work. That's when she began to do photography for Vogue in England, British Vogue, of the various women's forces. Those are some wonderful early books that she did, showing all the different auxiliary corps in which women were doing war work of various kinds. It was from there that she sought accreditation with the US Army so that she could become an official war photographer and travel to Europe after D-Day.
And some of the photographs that she did wind up taking were not just incredible, but disturbing in some ways.
Absolutely. She was very, very brave, extremely courageous. Here again, I think her desire to have the freedom that the boys had urged her on into often very dangerous situations, and situations that were very costly to her emotional balance and equilibrium. She teamed up with the wonderful life photographer David Sherman, who became a close friend of hers and Penrose, and the two of them were also lovers, she and Sherman. But thank goodness they often traveled together. Well, you're referring perhaps to when they go to photograph at the liberation of Dachau.
That's definitely one of the areas that she took some of those incredible photos.
Yes, and it was when I saw those photos for the first time that I thought, I have to write about this woman. I so admired her courage and marveled at the fact that she went from being a model on the cover of Vogue to being someone who chronicled the horrors of the death camps, not only Dachau, a number of others as well.
And she's quite well known. I mean, if anybody knows about Lee Miller, they probably know about a couple of those photos. The one in Hitler's bathtub, and another disturbing one really was the one of the three German citizens, one who was part of the army, who had committed suicide in their office. So those were, you really had to look back and wonder if those kinds of photos would have an effect later on in her life.
Well, she photographed what we might now call a collateral damage, the effect on ordinary people, on civilians, on all of us, really, of this carnage, of this horror. So while she did some very, very remarkable battle scenes, and she documented the use of napalm, she did all sorts of things that were, firsts. She also showed the human cost. If you'd like, I can hold up the back cover of my book to show the Lee Miller in Hitler's bathtub.
Right.
Is that the right level?
Oh, yeah. That is quite something.
Yes.
That look on her face.
Well, that story, as you know, Dachau is only something like 8 miles away from Munich. And Sherman and Davy Sherman and Lee had spent this horrendous day at Dachau. Lee partly doing what she could to help the survivors. I managed to interview a Dutch survivor whose testimony about that day was invaluable and who remembered Lee with such great fondness. Anyway, we can barely imagine what it would be like at the end of such a day when you take thousands of photographs of the conditions there, the dead bodies, the emaciated skeletons, and so on. They were, Davy and Lee then went with the other journalists to Munich, which was to be their billet for the night. And the journalists were taken to what had been Hitler's headquarters, because the American army had taken over the building in that it still had electricity, running water, and a telephone system. So they found themselves in one of the few buildings still standing where everything worked. So Lee and Davy took turns taking a bath in the bathroom nearest to where they were to stay. And that was, of course, Hitler's bathtub. You can imagine, you're thinking to yourself, will the dust and dirt of Dachau ever wash off? How can one ever forget or be untainted again after seeing what they saw? Well, to make the point clearer, Lee and probably Davy arranged a number of symbolic elements around the rim of the bathtub, including Hitler's photo. Can you see it?
Oh my gosh, yes.
And
yes.
a little classical statue that looks like Lee Miller, the idea of beauty facing off Hitler, facing off who actually would have approved of her as an Aryan, somebody blonde and blue-eyed, and put her dirty boots, her filthy, dirty army boots, on the bath mat in front of the bath, as if to suggest these are the elements of our life right now. What shall we make of this? So hence the look that you very rightly point to on her face of, oh, we can hardly put it in words. It's a tremendously powerful photograph. She also took one of Davy when it was his turn to get in the bathtub, but that's less well known.
But now following the war, it appears that she kind of lost herself or lost a purpose. I mean, I can understand that it would, being in those situations would be so intense, and then suddenly there's that release. So where did she go after that?
Well, I should fill in a little bit because it's partly explanatory. When the war was over, when the Germans had to give up and Hitler died, most people, I suppose, the journalists included, said to themselves, well, it's over. It's going to be a difficult transition, but I'll get on to whatever else I see to do next. Although it was not easy, for a number of journalists have said it was a very confusing time. Lee could not stop. She was on what we might call, for lack of better language, a kind of adrenaline high. She was driven to keep going through Eastern Europe. She continued across Germany into Eastern Europe, to Austria, to all of the other countries. As the Soviet forces went west, she and some of the US Army went east to see what was going to happen to Eastern Europe in this situation. She kept going and going and going for months, even after Davy Sherman gave up. And she went really on nerves alone and a lot of hard liquor and whatever company she could find. She couldn't stop. She did some excellent photojournalism during that time. But by the time she got as far east as she did, Bulgaria, Romania, those countries, she was practically burnt out. She was so exhausted from the intensity of what she'd been doing, how she'd been living, and that particular time in history. Davy Sherman cabled Roland Penrose. Remember, they were still good friends, although they had been kind of a ménage à trois. They were very close. And he said that Lee needed to come home. She might have broken down otherwise. So she did go back. She did go back to England. She went back to Penrose. She went back to a life in London where she could pull herself together, rest, find appropriate medical help. However, she did not make that transition very well or very easily at all. By, let's say, 47, she was pregnant. And this was very interesting. At age 40, she'd never wanted a child, but something in her changed, and she decided she would try to make a different kind of life for herself with Roland Penrose. And so she had the baby, their son, Anthony Penrose, and she, I won't say settled, but began a different kind of life as Mrs. Roland Penrose, both in their London apartment and then in their house in the country. It didn't really suit her. It was not, that's the sort of an understatement. No, what you're referring to is her turn to cookery. Is that what you were thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, it seemed to be a totally different lifestyle.
Well, it was practical. She found herself, for the most part, after the first few years, living in the country, in this rather large, sumptuous, and very unique, inspiring sort of English surrealist home, which is still there, Farley Farm. You can visit it. And she had masses of guests, old friends. People came over from France, Breton, Picasso, many of her female friends. You know, there were always lots of interesting artists, writers, and activists flowing in and out. And so why not, if you're finding yourself providing for their meals, take it seriously. Also, one thing she told me, which was amusing, food was terrible in England after World War II. It was worse than during the war. The shortages were so great. And since she was a good eater, an enthusiastic eater, she decided she would do something about it and do the very best she could with what she could find. So there were a number of reasons for her going into cookery. Plus, it was creative. She started making surrealist menus, for example. And also her editor at Vogue, the wonderful Audrey Withers, said, well, all right, my dear, you used to be a war correspondent, but why don't you do cookery columns for us now? So it kind of came together in that way.
She was slipping into alcoholism at that point, though, as well, wasn't she? I mean, and that created a lot of stress for the family. And there's been the suggestion that maybe that was a result of PTSD.
Yes, everyone drank a tremendous amount, of course, we have to realize in those days. However, she probably drank even more. And as these elaborate dishes and meals that she put together sometimes didn't appear till 10 or 11 at night, there was ample time and ample quantities of booze. Roland Penrose was very generous as a host. And so what she was drinking in the kitchen and the guests were drinking in the parlor, so to speak. This was a way of coping. And I think it's probably appropriate to speak about PTSD. It wasn't known in those days, and women would not have been thought of as likely to suffer from it. But as a person who survived both rape and the extreme horrors of war, I would say that, yes, we could consider her a person who could have used help of that kind that is now available, but certainly wasn't then. People just thought of her as this very bad-tempered, although often charming, kind of misplaced American woman. That was another element. As an American, in a certain way, she never really could or wanted to conform to the English conventions and standards with which she found herself dealing.
Well, do you think she ever came to terms with her life before she passed away?
That's an interesting question, Ernest. When we met in Paris in the year that she was dying, I would say, interestingly, she did seem at peace. However, I'd have to qualify this. I was deeply shocked and moved when early on in our conversation, she told me that she was dying. And she had made up her mind that she would experience the dying and the death on its own terms. She said to me something like, no, this is the greatest thing to do right now. And she went for it with such bravery. She did not express a regret to me. What she did do was pour out a lot of her feelings when we spoke over our several interviews. And so to answer your question, I think in a way she had come to terms with her life as she was facing the last months of it, as she was facing the end.
Well, so just to draw a conclusion here, we know that she struggled in many ways with her personal life, but there's no doubt that she was an accomplished model, photographer, photojournalist, which she never really expected to be doing. And then, of course, later on in life, I don't know if you would call her a chef, but an entertainer. What do you feel we should look at as her most notable achievements?
Well, I'll answer that backwards. Because I came in the course of time I was working on the book, I came around to changing my idea about her accomplishments as a cook and a chef. At first I thought, why did she give up photography to do cooking? Because I had a less than sympathetic or generous notion of what cookery was to her. Talking with her friends who cooked alongside her and who told me about the prizes she won, she actually was a prize-winning cook and an inventor, as I said, of very unusual, original, surrealist recipes. I came to understand that it was a creative field for her, but a different one, and that she poured her very considerable creative talents into cookery, just as she had brought them to other occupations earlier. But to come back to your question in a serious way, I would say that her accomplishments as a photographer, first, on her own, and then as a photojournalist during the course of the 1940s, which she was working for about 6 years with a good, solid body of work that is still being exhibited around the world. She made her name and will be remembered and honored and studied because of that remarkable body of work. Of course, people will always be interested in knowing, how did that beautiful model become this prodigious photographer, which is, why her life is of such great interest. So that would be my answer to your question.
Mm-hmm. That's a fascinating life, and it would be. I think more people should be aware of it, and everything that she contributed, whether it was in her profession or in leading the way for other women.
May I show you the front cover of the book?
Yeah, that photo is just stunning.
It's by Man Ray, of course, for whom she was a very inspiring model. There are so many remarkable photographs by Man Ray of Lee Miller, and the solarized profile being one that's very famous. And it was that one that caused me or allowed me to recognize her when we met. So the photos will be remembered, and as will, I think, her daring, her bravery, her gutsiness as a young woman photographer, and then a World War II photographer and photojournalist, because we shouldn't forget that she also wrote the stunning dispatches that accompanied her photos and were published in both American and British Vogue, and some in French Vogue too. So that's a major body of work.
She was extremely talented and a professional, and also led in the techniques of photography. So it wasn't just behind the camera, but in the dark room where they developed so many of those techniques.
Yes, she and Man Ray really developed solarization together, although it was partly an accident. She played a large part in some of the techniques for which he sometimes is given sole credit. Yeah, there is an exhibition that's just opened at the Metropolitan Museum in New York of women photographers, and the theme is women photography and the new woman. So, of course, some of her work is included in it, and I'm glad to see that her unusual and very striking and engaging example is now being seen in the larger context of women's entry into photography and women photographers' varied accomplishments in the early part of the 20th century, starting then.
Well, she was a remarkable woman, and your book was a wonderful read. It was hard to put that down. So very well done. I sure appreciate your time today to tell us about this fascinating story about Lee Miller and her unique life and her influence on other people.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I feel she's still with us in all sorts of important ways, and I like to talk about them. So thank you, Ernest.
Okay. Thanks very much, Carolyn, and I thank all of you for listening today. We'll see you again soon.
Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.